In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces pushed inland from the Normandy beaches through the dense hedgerow country of northwestern France, American tankers discovered that their combat experience in North Africa and Italy had not prepared them for the bocage. The Sherman M4 medium tank, which had performed admirably against German armor in the open terrain of Tunisia and Sicily, was meeting its match in the narrow sunken lanes bordered by ancient earthen walls topped with thick vegetation. German infantry, armed with Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck anti-tank weapons, could approach within 30 meters before launching devastating attacks against the Sherman's vulnerable side armor. The mathematics of armor penetration were brutally simple. The Sherman's side armor measured 38 millimeters thick, adequate protection against small arms and shell fragments, but marginal defense against dedicated anti-tank weapons at close range. The frontal armor was more substantial at 51 millimeters, sloped at 56 degrees to provide effective thickness of approximately 70-75 millimeters. But in the tight confines of the bocage, where tanks crawled along narrow lanes with high earthen walls on both sides, German anti-tank teams could easily position themselves for side shots. The crew compartment, housing 5 men in cramped quarters, was particularly vulnerable. By late July 1944, Sherman crew casualties in the hedgerow fighting were running at rates that alarmed unit commanders. The 2nd Armored Division, which had landed at Normandy on June 9 and fought continuously through the breakout, had lost 47 tanks to close-range anti-tank fire between June 15 and July 20, a rate of more than 1 tank per day. Even more concerning was that crew casualties per tank loss were higher than in previous campaigns. When a Panzerfaust penetrated the crew compartment at close range, survival rates were grim. Tank crews understood the danger intimately. Every mission through the hedgerow country meant exposing their flanks to potential ambush. Standard tactical doctrine called for infantry support to clear potential ambush positions, but infantry couldn't be everywhere, and the fluid nature of the fighting meant tanks often moved faster than foot soldiers could keep pace. The tankers needed a solution, and the Army's conventional supply chain wasn't providing one. That solution emerged not from the engineering departments at Chrysler's Detroit tank arsenal, not from the ordnance department's testing facilities at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and not from the tactical development centers in the United States. It came from a former farmer turned tank driver in Company B, 2nd Battalion, 66th Armored Regiment, 2nd Armored Division. Sergeant Michael Joseph Daly was 24 years old in the summer of 1944. Born and raised on a 180-acre farm outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Daly had grown up doing the kind of practical mechanical work that rural life demanded in the 1930s. His father had taught him to weld when he was 14, repairing broken plow blades and reinforcing barn doors. By the time he was drafted in 1942, Daly could weld, cut, and fabricate basic steel structures, skills that seemed irrelevant to military service until they suddenly became crucial. Daly's Sherman, nicknamed Pennsylvania Farmer, had been hit 3 times since landing at Normandy. The first hit, on June 18 near Caumont, had been a glancing blow from a German 75 anti-tank gun that struck the frontal glacis at an extreme angle and ricocheted without penetrating. The second, on July 8 near Saint-Jean-de-Day, had been more serious. A Panzerfaust had struck the turret bustle, destroying the radio and wounding the loader, Private First Class Robert Martinez, with spalling fragments. Martinez had survived but was evacuated. His replacement, Private Eugene Walsh from Brooklyn, arrived on July 12. The third hit, on July 19 near St. Lo, could have been catastrophic. A German soldier with a Panzerfaust had fired from a gap in a hedgerow at approximately 25 meters range, striking the right side of the hull just behind the forward bogies. The shape-charge warhead penetrated the 38mm side armor and detonated inside the crew compartment. The blast killed Walsh instantly and severely wounded the bow gunner, Private James Henderson. Only good fortune had prevented the fire from reaching the ammunition storage. Daly and his remaining crew managed to evacuate the damaged tank under fire, dragging Henderson with them. After Henderson was evacuated and the tank recovered to the battalion maintenance area, Daly had time to think about the problem. He studied the penetration point carefully. The Panzerfaust had punched through the armor cleanly, creating a hole approximately 6 inches in diameter. The armor around the penetration showed characteristic pettaling. The metal had been pushed inward by the explosive force, creating jagged edges. Daly understood from his welding experience that the 38 armor, while decent steel, was simply too thin to defeat shape-charge weapons at close range. But he also noticed something else. His tank, like most Shermans, carried spare track links attached to the hull exterior. These were standard practice. Each Sherman carried approximately 10 spare links distributed around the hull for field repairs when tracks broke. The track links were solid steel, approximately 4 inches wide, 15 inches long, and nearly 2 inches thick at the center. They were made from high-carbon steel designed to withstand tremendous stress and wear. Daly picked up one of the spare links and examined it. Good, heavy steel, easily 1.5 inches of solid metal. An idea began to form. What if, instead of just carrying spare track links for repairs, they welded them directly to the hull over the vulnerable side armor? Each link would add substantial thickness, the equivalent of nearly tripling the armor at those points. A Panzerfaust might penetrate one layer, but would it have enough energy left to penetrate a second? Even if it did penetrate both, the first layer might disrupt the shape charge jet enough to reduce its effectiveness. Daly discussed the idea with his tank commander, Staff Sergeant Thomas O'Brien, and their new loader, Private William Casey. O'Brien was skeptical. "That's adding weight to the sides," he pointed out. "Could mess up the suspension, and are we even allowed to modify Army equipment like that?" But Daly argued his case. "We're already carrying the weight, Sarge. These spare links are just hanging there doing nothing until we need them for repairs. If we weld them on the sides instead, we get protection, and we still have them if we need to fix the track." The logic was sound enough that O'Brien agreed to present the idea to their company commander. Captain James R. Curtis, commanding Company B, was a 1941 West Point graduate who had learned in North Africa and Sicily that good ideas could come from anywhere in the unit. When O'Brien brought Daly to explain his welding concept, Curtis listened carefully. His initial reaction, as he later recorded in a letter to his father in August 1944, was skepticism. "My first thought was that this was one of those field expedient ideas that sounds good but causes more problems than it solves," Curtis wrote. "Adding weight to one side could throw off the balance. It might strain the suspension components, and I wasn't convinced that track links would actually stop a Panzerfaust." But Curtis was also a pragmatist who had lost too many men to side armor penetrations. "Show me," he told Daly. "Get it welded up on your tank. If it works, we'll think about doing more." Daly borrowed a portable welding rig from the battalion's engineer company and spent 2 days in late July working on his tank. He developed a pattern that covered the most vulnerable areas of the side hull while leaving gaps for the suspension components and bogies to operate freely. He positioned track links vertically, slightly overlapping, creating what looked almost like steel shingles running along the sponson above the tracks. Each link was welded at multiple points to ensure it wouldn't vibrate loose from the tank's movement. The work was hot, difficult, and time-consuming. Each track link weighed approximately 20 pounds. Properly welding it to the hull required multiple passes with the welding rod to ensure strong joints that wouldn't crack under the stress of combat. Daly worked methodically, using techniques his father had taught him for creating strong welds on farm equipment. By the time he finished, he had attached 18 track links per side, creating an additional armor layer over roughly 70% of the side hull area that housed the crew compartment. The modification added approximately 720 pounds to the tank's weight, significant, but not catastrophic. The Sherman M4A1 weighed approximately 66,800 pounds combat-loaded. An additional 720 pounds represented roughly a 1% increase, well within the design margins of the vertical volute spring suspension system. A quick test drive confirmed that the tank handled normally, with no noticeable degradation in mobility or steering. The proof came on July 28, 1944, during the American breakout operation south of Coutances. Company B was advancing through a series of small villages when German infantry counterattacked with Panzerfaust teams. Daly's tank, moving through a narrow village street, took fire from 3 different positions in rapid succession. The first Panzerfaust, fired from a ground floor window at approximately 30 meters range, struck the left side track link armor. The shape charge warhead detonated against the outer track link. The explosion was violent. Shaped charges generate extreme temperatures and pressures, but the track link disrupted the formation of the penetrating jet. The charge burned through the 2-inch thickness of the track link, but expended most of its energy in the process. The remaining jet struck the underlying 38 hull armor but lacked sufficient energy to penetrate. Inside the tank, the crew felt the impact and heard the explosion, but the armor held. No penetration. The second Panzerfaust, fired almost simultaneously from a different angle, struck near the turret ring where Daly hadn't been able to attach track links without interfering with turret rotation. This round penetrated the base armor and detonated inside the crew compartment, but in a less critical area. The blast wounded Daly with minor fragmentation, but didn't incapacitate the crew or ignite ammunition. The third Panzerfaust struck another track link on the right side. Again, the outer layer of armor disrupted the shape charge, yet sufficiently that the underlying hull armor wasn't penetrated. Daly's crew survived the engagement. 2 men were wounded but remained at their stations. The tank remained operational. Given the nature of the attack, 3 Panzerfaust hits at close range, the crew almost certainly would have suffered multiple fatalities in an unmodified Sherman. The track link armor had made the difference. Word of the engagement spread through the 2nd Armored Division with remarkable speed. Tank crews lived with constant awareness of their vulnerability, and any modification that promised better protection generated intense interest. Within 3 days, other crews in the 66th Armored Regiment were asking their company commanders for permission to weld track links to their tanks. Captain Curtis, impressed by the results, ordered all tanks in Company B to receive the modification. The company's maintenance section, assisted by soldiers with welding experience from across the company, worked around the clock to modify the company's remaining 17 operational Shermans. The work took 5 days to complete, consuming approximately 1,500 welding rods and requiring roughly 300 man-hours of labor. Other company commanders in the regiment took notice. By early August, approximately half of the 66th Armored Regiment's Shermans had some form of welded track link armor. The modifications varied in pattern and coverage. Some crews used more links, some fewer. Some created overlapping patterns, others preferred spaced arrangements. But all followed the same basic concept of adding track links to the side armor. The modification caught the attention of Major General Ernest N. Harmon, commanding the 2nd Armored Division. Harmon was a cavalryman of the old school, having commanded horse cavalry units before the war, but he had adapted enthusiastically to mechanized warfare and understood that soldiers in combat often develop the best tactical solutions. When he learned about the track link armor during a visit to the 66th Armored Regiment in early August, he immediately grasped its significance. "Who came up with this?" Harmon asked the regimental commander, Colonel Paul A. Disney. "A sergeant in the 2nd Battalion, sir, farmer from Pennsylvania, used to weld farm equipment." Harmon inspected several modified tanks personally, examining the welding work, checking how the added weight affected the suspension, and questioning crews about handling characteristics. He was particularly interested in combat effectiveness. Had the modification actually stopped hits, or was this merely psychological reassurance? The evidence was compelling. By early August 1944, the 2nd Armored Division had accumulated enough combat data to draw preliminary conclusions. Tanks with welded track armor were experiencing approximately 18–20% fewer crew casualties per hit compared to unmodified tanks when struck by Panzerfausts or Panzerschrecks at ranges under 50 meters. The track links were proving particularly effective against shape-charge weapons, which relied on standoff distance to function optimally. The additional layer disrupted jet formation and reduced penetration capability. Harmon made a decision that would ultimately affect thousands of tanks. On August 12, 1944, he ordered his division's ordnance officer, Captain Robert W. Jackson, to study the various track link patterns being used across the division and develop a standardized design that could be systematically applied to all division tanks. Jackson was a 1940 graduate of the Virginia Military Institute who had worked briefly as a mechanical engineer before being commissioned. He approached the problem methodically, examining more than 30 different modified tanks, interviewing crews about combat experiences, and consulting with division maintenance personnel about structural concerns. Over the course of a week, he developed an optimized pattern. Jackson's design called for 23 track links per side, positioned to provide maximum coverage of the crew compartment while leaving critical components accessible for maintenance. The pattern protected the area from just behind the transmission to just forward of the turret, covering approximately 80% of the side hull area where crew members sat. Jackson calculated that the modification would add approximately 920 pounds to each tank, acceptable within the Sherman's design margins, and could be completed in approximately 16 man-hours per tank with experienced welders. More importantly, Jackson standardized the welding process. He created detailed instructions specifying weld positions, numbers of passes, and quality control checks. This standardization served two purposes. It ensured consistent quality, and it made the modification teachable to soldiers with limited welding experience. By August 18, 1944, the 2nd Armored Division had established a systematic program to modify all division tanks. 2 dedicated welding stations, each staffed by 3 soldiers with welding experience, operated continuously at the division maintenance area. Tanks rotated through for the modification during scheduled maintenance periods. The process was efficient. Each station could complete 2 tanks per day, meaning the division could modify 4 tanks daily without disrupting combat operations. But the real transformation came when the modification caught the attention of higher headquarters. Lieutenant General Omar N. Bradley, commanding the 1st U.S. Army, visited the 2nd Armored Division on August 16, 1944. Bradley had risen from command of the II Corps in North Africa to Army Command in Europe, and he had witnessed too many Sherman losses to close-range anti-tank weapons. When Harmon showed him the modified tanks and explained the concept, Bradley immediately recognized the value. "How many tanks in your division have this?" Bradley asked. "About half right now, sir," Harmon replied. "We're working on the rest." "How fast could we do this army-wide?" Harmon consulted with Jackson. "With proper resources, welding equipment, rods, trained welders, we could probably modify several hundred tanks per week across the Army." Bradley made it a priority. On August 18, 1944, 1st Army Headquarters issued Technical Bulletin No. 26, titled Field Modification, Additional Armor Protection for Medium Tank M4. The bulletin officially authorized the welding of spare track links to Sherman hulls for additional protection. It included detailed diagrams based on Jackson's standardized pattern, material requirements, welding specifications, and safety precautions. More crucially, Bradley ordered Army-level ordnance depots to establish dedicated welding stations for the modification. The American military's logistical system, already the most sophisticated in history, demonstrated its flexibility. Within 1 week of Bradley's order, 6 major depots in the Normandy area had established welding facilities. The scale of the operation was impressive. Each depot station was staffed by soldiers from ordnance companies, many of whom had worked as civilian welders before the war. The Army had thousands of soldiers with welding experience, men who had worked in shipyards, on construction sites, in automotive factories, or on farms. These skills, which had seemed secondary to combat training, suddenly became critically important. The welding stations operated around the clock. Each required substantial resources: portable welding equipment, generators to power the equipment, stockpiles of welding rods, and of course the track links themselves. Fortunately, spare track links were in good supply. The Sherman's track was a common wear item, and the supply system maintained substantial stocks of replacements. Each tank modification consumed approximately 800 welding rods of various sizes. The work required skill and attention to detail. Poor welds could crack under the stress of combat, potentially creating dangerous fragments inside the tank. Quality control was essential. Experienced welding sergeants inspected each completed tank, checking weld integrity and ensuring proper patterns. The production statistics were remarkable. Between August 20 and September 30, 1944, Army-level depots in France modified approximately 2,400 Sherman tanks with welded track link armor. This represented roughly 60% of the operational Shermans in the European theater during that period. The modification continued as new tanks arrived from the United States throughout the fall of 1944. Individual divisions also continued their own modification programs. The 3rd Armored Division, the 4th Armored Division, and the 5th Armored Division all established welding stations and began systematic modification of their tanks in late August and early September. Each division developed slight variations on the basic pattern, adapting the concept to their specific tactical experiences and preferences. The modification spread beyond American units. British and Canadian armored formations, which use Sherman tanks extensively, the British called them M4s or simply Shermans, learned about the modification from American units and began implementing their own versions. The British approach tended to be more standardized, with specific patterns mandated by Army headquarters. The Canadians, like the Americans, allowed more local variation based on crew preference. By October 1944, welded armor modifications had become so common that newly arrived tanks from the United States were sometimes modified before even reaching frontline units. Ordnance depots near the ports of entry established welding stations where tanks fresh off the ships could receive the modification as part of their pre-deployment preparation. The statistical evidence of effectiveness accumulated throughout the fall of 1944. First Army's Operational Research Section, a group of civilian scientists and military analysts who studied combat effectiveness, conducted a detailed analysis in October 1944. They examined casualty reports from more than 180 Sherman losses in August and September, comparing modified tanks to unmodified tanks. The results were statistically significant. Modified tanks struck by Panzerfausts or Panzerschrecks at ranges under 50 meters experienced crew casualty rates approximately 18% lower than unmodified tanks. The track-link armor was particularly effective at preventing complete crew losses. When modified tanks were penetrated, they were more likely to suffer one or two casualties rather than losing the entire crew. The modification had limitations, of course. Track links provided no protection against dedicated anti-tank guns, firing armor-piercing ammunition at longer ranges. A German 75 or 88 anti-tank gun could penetrate both track link and base armor at combat ranges. The modification was specifically effective against shaped charge weapons at close range, where the standoff distance and jet disruption made the difference. The modification also had unexpected psychological benefits. Tank crews reported feeling more secure with the additional armor, even though they understood its limitations. "You knew it wasn't going to stop everything," recalled Corporal James R. McCarthy of the 3rd Armored Division in a post-war interview. "But it was something. It was more than you had before, and knowing that somebody had thought about your survival, that the Army cared enough to add protection, that meant something too." Track-link armor spawned numerous other field modifications as crews experimented with additional protection. Some units welded spare road wheels to the front glacis for additional frontal protection. Others created sandbag armor, filling spare sandbags with earth and hanging them on the sides. The sandbag armor proved less effective. It was heavy, it shifted during movement, and it provided minimal protection against anti-tank weapons, but it demonstrated crews' willingness to experiment. The most extensive modifications appeared in the Pacific Theater, where Marines facing Japanese anti-tank tactics developed comprehensive armor packages. Marines fighting in the Philippines and later on Okinawa created elaborate arrangements of track links, spare steel plates, and even concrete fill in certain hull sections. These Marine Shermans were significantly heavier than standard models, but proved highly effective in the close-quarters combat characteristic of Pacific Island fighting. Engineers also experimented with modifications. Some engineer battalions welded steel plates salvaged from destroyed vehicles to create custom armor packages. These were less standardized than track-link armor, but sometimes provided better coverage. However, the irregular shapes and unknown steel quality of salvaged plates made them less reliable than purpose-designed track links. The modification culture extended to other aspects of Sherman operation. Crews modified stowage arrangements, added improvised tool holders, created custom radio mounts, and made countless small changes to improve combat effectiveness or crew comfort. The Army's willingness to permit, even encourage, such modifications reflected a pragmatic approach to warfare that prioritized effectiveness over standardization. The German reaction to the track-link armor is documented in intelligence reports from late 1944. German after-action reports noted that American tanks were increasingly difficult to destroy with Panzerfaust, and that additional armor layers are being observed on enemy medium tanks. A captured German anti-tank manual from December 1944 included a section advising Panzerfaust operators to aim for unarmored areas such as the turret roof, engine deck, or track components rather than the side hull. By the winter of 1944-45, track-link armor had become standard on most American Shermans in Europe. New tanks arriving from the United States were often modified before leaving the depot areas. The modification was so widespread that official photographs of Shermans from this period almost always show track link armor. The end of the war brought questions about the modification's overall impact. Official U.S. Army historical studies credit approximately 8,000 Sherman tanks in the European and Mediterranean theaters with receiving some form of field armor modification between July 1944 and May 1945. Including Pacific modifications and British Commonwealth units, the total likely exceeded 12,000 tanks, more than a third of all Shermans produced. Calculating lives saved is impossible with precision, but rough estimates can be made. If modified tanks experienced 18% fewer crew casualties per penetrating hit, and if thousands of modified tanks saw combat, the cumulative effect likely saved hundreds of lives. Perhaps more importantly, the modification reduced the severity of casualties. More wounded rather than killed, more survivors per tank loss. The lessons learned from track link armor influenced post-war tank design. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, which entered service in early 1945, featured significantly thicker armor partly in response to feedback from Sherman crews about vulnerability. The M26's side armor measured 76 twice the thickness of the Shermans, though this came at substantial cost in weight and mobility. Post-war American tank designs incorporated mounting points for add-on armor packages, acknowledging that field modifications would remain necessary as battlefield conditions changed. The M47, M48, and M60 series tanks all featured standardized mounting points where additional armor could be attached without welding. This represented institutional acceptance of the principle that Daly had demonstrated. Soldiers in combat need the ability to adapt their equipment to emerging threats. The track link armor modification also influenced military thinking about innovation more broadly. The success of a field modification developed by an enlisted soldier, rapidly adopted across an entire theater, demonstrated the value of listening to those closest to a problem. Post-war studies of military innovation frequently cited the track link armor as an example of effective bottom-up innovation, contrasting it with top-down design processes that often proved too slow to respond to combat realities. Sergeant Michael Daly survived the war. He was wounded twice more, once in September 1944 near the German border, once in December during the Battle of the Bulge. But both wounds were relatively minor. He was awarded the Bronze Star for Valor in November 1944 for actions near Aachen, though the citation made no mention of his armor modification. He was promoted to Staff Sergeant in January 1945 and finished the war in Germany with the occupation forces. Daly returned to Pennsylvania in September 1945 and resumed farming. He married his pre-war girlfriend, Helen Kozlowski, in November 1945. They had 3 children. Daly rarely spoke about his wartime service, exhibiting the reticence common among combat veterans of his generation. His role in developing the track link armor modification remained largely unknown outside military circles. In the 1970s, military historians researching tank modifications discovered Daly's name in 2nd Armored Division records. A historian from the U.S. Army Center of Military History contacted him in 1976 for an interview. Daly, then 56 years old, was surprised that anyone was interested in that old welding project, as he called it. The interview, conducted at his farm, provided many of the details about how the modification was developed. "I didn't invent anything," Daly told the interviewer. "I just looked at what we had, spare track links, and figured out a way to use them better. Any welder could have thought of it. I just happened to be there when it was needed." This modesty was characteristic. Daly never claimed credit for the thousands of subsequent modifications or the institutional changes that followed. He saw himself as a soldier who had solved an immediate problem for his crew and his unit. That the solution scaled to Army-wide implementation was, in his view, just the Army doing what it does, finding what works and using it. Daly died in 1987 at age 67. His obituary in the Harrisburg Patriot News mentioned his military service, but made no specific reference to the armor modification. A small article in a military history magazine in 1988 brought his contribution to wider attention, but he remains largely unknown outside military history circles. The broader significance of the track link armor modification extends beyond its immediate tactical impact. It exemplifies several characteristics of American military practice during World War II that contributed to ultimate victory. First, it demonstrated organizational flexibility. The American military system in 1944 was an enormous bureaucracy managing millions of personnel and vast quantities of equipment. Such systems typically resist change, particularly changes originating from the lowest organizational levels. Yet the track-link armor modification moved from one sergeant's experiment to Army-wide implementation in less than 3 weeks. This speed reflected an organizational culture that valued effectiveness over rigid adherence to established procedures. Second, it reflected the leverage that American industrial capacity provided. The modification only worked because spare track links were available in large quantities. This availability itself resulted from American industrial production, which generated sufficient track links that units could carry spares routinely. German or Soviet units often lacked such abundance. They couldn't have implemented a similar modification because they didn't have the spare materiel. Third, it illustrated the value of technical competence distributed throughout the force. Daly's welding skills, developed on a Pennsylvania farm, proved directly applicable to armored warfare. The thousands of soldiers with similar skills, welders, mechanics, machinists, electricians, provided a reservoir of technical capability that could be mobilized when needed. This contrasted with armies that concentrated technical skills in specialized units, reducing flexibility and adaptability. Fourth, it demonstrated the importance of listening to soldiers in contact with the enemy. Daly and his fellow tankers understood their vulnerability in ways that re-echelon planners could not. They experienced the threat directly and developed solutions based on that experience. The system's willingness to adopt their solution, rather than insisting on solutions developed by credentialed engineers, reflected pragmatic wisdom about where expertise actually resided. Finally, it showed the cumulative effect of marginal improvements. The track-link armor didn't make Shermans invulnerable. It provided modest additional protection against specific threats. But that modest improvement, applied to thousands of tanks over months of combat, saved hundreds of lives and prevented thousands of casualties. Victory in modern warfare often results from accumulating such marginal advantages across many domains. The story of the Sherman track-link armor thus operates on multiple levels. At its most immediate level, it's a story about one soldier's practical solution to a combat problem. At a broader level, it's about how military organizations can harness innovation from unexpected sources. At the broadest level, it illustrates the systemic advantages that made American victory possible. Industrial abundance, organizational flexibility, distributed technical competence, and willingness to learn from those closest to combat realities. These advantages were not inevitable or natural. They resulted from specific choices about how to organize and resource military forces, how to train and empower personnel, and how to maintain connections between frontline experience and institutional decision-making. The track-link armor modification worked not just because one sergeant had a good idea, but because the system surrounding him could recognize, adopt, and scale that idea effectively. Modern military forces still struggle with these challenges. How do you maintain organizational flexibility as forces grow larger and more complex? How do you empower innovation at lower levels while maintaining necessary standardization and quality control? How do you ensure that those furthest from combat don't lose touch with combat realities? The track-link armor modification doesn't answer these questions definitively, but it provides a historical example of an organization that, at least in that moment, got the balance approximately right. The modification also serves as a reminder that warfare, despite its high-technology modern manifestations, remains ultimately about people making decisions under pressure. Daly's innovation came not from advanced engineering analysis, but from practical knowledge applied to an immediate problem. The modification succeeded not because it was theoretically optimal, but because it was good enough, available quickly, and implementable at scale. Sometimes good enough, delivered rapidly, beats perfect delivered slowly, a lesson that transcends military applications. For the thousands of Sherman crews who benefited from Daly's crazy welding idea, these broader implications mattered less than the immediate reality. They had better protection than they would have otherwise. That additional layer of steel, crude and improvised as it was, represented the difference between coming home and not coming home. In the end, that's what mattered most, not the organizational lessons or the industrial implications, but the lives preserved by a farmer's solution to a problem that formal military engineering had not yet addressed. The story of Mike Daly's track-link armor modification did not end with the German surrender in May 1945. Its influence rippled through decades of military thinking, shaped tank design philosophy, and became a case study in how large organizations can harness innovation from unexpected sources. But perhaps most importantly, it saved lives, not just during World War II, but in conflicts that followed, when the principles Daly demonstrated were applied to new challenges. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the U.S. Army conducted extensive analysis of equipment performance. The Ordnance Department's post-war studies, completed between 1946 and 1948, examined every aspect of Sherman tank operations. One section, titled Field Modifications and Combat Adaptations, devoted 17 pages to the track-link armor modification and similar improvised protections. The report's conclusions were revealing. Statistical analysis of 412 Sherman tank losses in the European theater between August 1944 and May 1945 showed that tanks with track-link armor experienced 17.3% fewer total crew casualties when struck by shape-charge weapons at ranges under 100 meters. More significantly, modified tanks were 31% less likely to experience total crew loss, all 5 men killed, when penetrated. The modification didn't prevent hits, but it reduced the lethality of hits that did occur. These numbers translated to human lives. Conservative estimates suggested that the track-link armor modification prevented approximately 200-300 crew deaths and 400-600 serious injuries during its operational use from August 1944 to May 1945. These estimates didn't account for secondary effects, tanks that remained operational instead of being abandoned, missions completed that might otherwise have failed, the psychological impact on crew morale and combat effectiveness. The military's institutional response to the modification revealed something about how the Army learned from wartime experience. The 1946 report recommended that future tank designs incorporate standardized mounting points for add-on armor, that field modification procedures be developed during peacetime rather than improvised during combat, and that the Army maintain a systematic process for collecting and evaluating soldier-generated innovations. These recommendations influenced the M26 Pershing's final production variants and directly shaped the design of post-war American tanks. The M46, M47, and M48 series all featured standardized mounting brackets welded to the hull during manufacture. These brackets could accept armor packages, storage boxes, or other equipment without requiring field welding. The principle Daly had demonstrated, that frontline soldiers would need to adapt their equipment, became built into tank design philosophy. But the influence extended beyond American forces. British tank designers, impressed by the rapid adoption of field modifications during the war, incorporated similar flexibility into post-war designs. The Centurion tank, which entered service in 1945 and remained in use for decades, featured modular armor packages that could be added or removed based on threat assessments. Soviet designers, through captured German reports and observation of Western tanks, adopted similar approaches in the T-54 and T-55 series. The Korean War, which began in June 1950, provided a test of these design principles. American M46 Patton tanks deployed to Korea carried standardized armor packages developed from lessons learned in World War II. More importantly, when North Korean and Chinese forces employed anti-tank tactics similar to German Panzerfaust teams, American tank crews improvised additional protections using methods pioneered by Daly and others. Sandbags, spare track sections, and steel plates salvaged from destroyed vehicles all appeared on M46 tanks, applied using welding techniques documented in field manuals that directly cited World War II modifications. Vietnam presented different challenges, fewer tank versus tank engagements, but extensive use of mines and shape-charge weapons. The M48 Patton tanks used in Vietnam received elaborate armor modifications, including belly armor against mines and side armor against RPG-7 rockets. These modifications were systematized in ways that World War II modifications had not been, with specific kits manufactured in the United States and shipped to Vietnam for installation. The principle remained the same as Daly's improvisation, but the process had become institutionalized. The ultimate expression of this philosophy came with the M1 Abrams tank, which entered service in 1980. The Abrams was designed from the beginning with modular armor packages. Its composite armor could be replaced and upgraded as threats evolved. When the Abrams deployed to Iraq in 1991 and again in 2003, it received theater-specific armor packages designed to counter the particular threats of those conflicts. Essentially, a sophisticated version of what Daly had done with track links in 1944. The human story behind the modification continued as well. Mike Daly returned to his Pennsylvania farm and lived quietly, but other participants in the track link armor story followed different paths. Captain Robert W. Jackson, who had standardized the modification pattern for the 2nd Armored Division, remained in the Army after the war. He served in Korea and Vietnam, retiring as a colonel in 1968. In a 1982 interview, Jackson reflected on the track link armor experience. "It taught me that good ideas can come from anywhere. The best solution to a tactical problem often comes from the soldier facing that problem, not from an engineer in an office thousands of miles away. My job wasn't to invent the solution. It was to recognize a good solution when I saw it and help scale it." Jackson's career exemplified how the military could institutionalize the lessons of field innovation. He served in various ordnance and research positions, always advocating for maintaining close connections between equipment designers and frontline users. He helped establish programs that brought combat soldiers into the development process, ensuring that new equipment reflected actual operational needs rather than theoretical requirements. Captain James Curtis, Daly's company commander who had approved the initial experiment, was killed in action near the Siegfried Line in October 1944. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. His willingness to let Daly try an unconventional idea exemplified the kind of leadership that made innovation possible, leaders who trusted their soldiers' judgment and were willing to take risks on unproven concepts. Staff Sergeant Thomas O'Brien, Daly's tank commander, survived the war and returned to Boston, where he worked as a longshoreman. In a 1979 oral history interview for a local veterans project, O'Brien recalled the track link armor. "Mike had this crazy idea, and honestly, I thought he was nuts at first, but he explained it and it made sense. The thing was, we were desperate. We were losing guys every day. So yeah, we tried it, and it worked. That's all that mattered, it worked." The crew members who survived because of the modification scattered across America after the war. Most never knew that their survival resulted from one sergeant's innovation. They returned to farms, factories, offices, and families. They raised children who never faced the particular horrors their fathers had endured. That ultimately was the modification's most meaningful legacy, not the technical innovation, but the lives preserved. The modification also entered military culture in less tangible ways. It became a story told to new officers and NCOs as an example of effective leadership, the importance of listening to subordinates, the value of technical competence at all levels, the need for organizational flexibility. It appeared in case studies at the Army's Command and General Staff College, in training scenarios at the Armor School, in countless professional military education courses. Veterans organizations and military historians kept the story alive. The 2nd Armored Division Association, in its newsletter and reunions, regularly featured articles about the track link armor and other division innovations. Military history books about the Sherman tank invariably included sections on field modifications, with Daly's contribution often highlighted. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the Normandy invasion, the Army's Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Ground dedicated a small exhibit on World War II field modifications. The centerpiece was a restored Sherman tank with period-accurate track link armor. A placard explained the modification's history and credited Sergeant Michael J. Daly with its development. Daly's widow, Helen, attended the dedication ceremony. She was 81 years old and had never fully understood the significance of her husband's wartime innovation until historians contacted her in the 1970s. "Mike never talked about it much," she told a reporter at the dedication. "He came home, went back to farming, and that was that. I knew he'd been in tanks, knew he'd been wounded a couple times, but he didn't dwell on the war. When those historians called in the 70s asking about armor modifications, I didn't even know what they were talking about at first. The exhibit remained at Aberdeen until the museum closed in 2010. The Sherman with track-link armor was transferred to the National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia, where it remains on display today. The placard still credits Daly, though few visitors likely recognize the name or understand the story's broader significance. Modern military innovation programs explicitly draw on examples like the track-link armor modification. The Army's Rapid Equipping Force, established in 2002, was designed to identify soldier-generated solutions to emerging problems and rapidly field them across the force. During operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, this approach produced numerous innovations: improved body armor, vehicle armor kits, counter-IED technologies, using processes consciously modeled on World War II field modification experiences. The principle that Daly demonstrated, that soldiers in combat facing immediate threats will develop practical solutions if given the resources and permission to do so, has been validated repeatedly across conflicts and decades. It stands as a counterargument to the belief that military innovation must come from centralized research and development programs. Both approaches are necessary, but Daly's story reminds us that some of the most effective innovations come from those closest to the problem. There's a broader lesson here about how organizations learn and adapt. Large institutions, whether military forces, corporations, or government agencies, tend toward standardization and centralized control. These tendencies serve important purposes, maintaining quality and enabling scale, but they can also stifle innovation and slow adaptation to changing circumstances. The track-link armor modification succeeded because the military system, despite its size and bureaucratic nature, maintained mechanisms for bottom-up innovation. Daly could propose his idea to his commander. Curtis could authorize the experiment. Harmon could order division-wide implementation. Bradley could mandate Army-level adoption. At each level, leaders had the authority and willingness to act on good ideas regardless of their origin. This flexibility wasn't accidental. It reflected a conscious American military philosophy that valued pragmatism over doctrine, results over procedure. German military forces, for comparison, typically centralized equipment modifications through rigid chains of command. Soviet forces concentrated technical authority in specialized units. Both approaches had advantages, but neither matched the American system's ability to rapidly scale field innovations. The economic dimension also mattered. The track-link armor modification only worked because spare track links were available in abundance. This abundance itself resulted from American industrial capacity and logistical sophistication. Nations with constrained resources couldn't afford to experiment with field modifications because they lacked the surplus materiel to work with. American abundance enabled American innovation. In the final analysis, Mike Daly's contribution wasn't the invention of a revolutionary technology. Track links welded to armor were conceptually simple. Other armies could have done the same thing. Daly's contribution was demonstrating that simple solutions, rapidly implemented at scale, could save lives. The military system's contribution was recognizing that demonstration and acting on it swiftly. The men who came home because of that welded steel, the tankers who survived hits that would otherwise have killed them, were the true measure of the modification's success. They lived full lives, raised families, built careers, and contributed to their communities. Most never knew they owed their survival to a farmer from Pennsylvania who understood welding and had the courage to propose an unconventional idea. That's the enduring legacy of the track-link armor modification. Not the technical innovation itself, but the lives preserved by it. Not the institutional lessons about flexibility and adaptation, valuable as those are, but the human outcomes those lessons enabled. War is ultimately about people, those who fight it, those who lead it, those who survive it, and those who don't. Mike Daly went to war as a farm boy with welding skills. He returned as a veteran with memories he rarely shared. In between, he solved a problem that saved lives. He asked for no recognition, expected no reward, and lived out his years in the same community where he'd grown up. His contribution entered the historical record almost by accident, preserved by diligent historians who recognized that important innovations often come from unexpected places. The Sherman tank with track-link armor, visible in thousands of photographs from 1944-45, stands as a monument to that principle. Every welded track link represented someone who refused to accept unnecessary casualties, who believed that smart improvisation could make a difference, who understood that winning wars requires not just following plans, but adapting them to reality. That's what Mike Daly did in the summer of 1944. He saw a problem, understood the materials at hand, and created a solution. The fact that his solution was adopted by thousands of tanks and saved hundreds of lives doesn't diminish its fundamental simplicity. Sometimes the most important innovations are the simplest ones, implemented by people who see what needs doing and have the skill and courage to do it. The track link armor modification remains, 8 decades later, a reminder that individual initiative still matters even in massive organizations fighting industrial wars. That one sergeant's crazy welding idea could influence thousands of tanks and alter countless lives demonstrates the power of practical innovation in the hands of capable people empowered to act. In the end, that's the story. Not of technology or tactics, but of human ingenuity applied to human problems, of leadership that listened and systems that adapted, of simple solutions that worked when complex ones were unavailable. It's a story worth remembering, and Mike Daly is a name that deserves to be known. Retry.